10 ancient scripts that prove civilizations that shouldn't exist. Number 10. The Singapore Stone. In the first weeks of 1843, a colonial engineer in Singapore looked at an enormous slab of sandstone standing at the mouth of the Singapore River and decided it was in the way. The acting settlement engineer, Captain D.H. Stevenson, ordered it cleared to widen the river channel and make room for a new fort and the quarters of its commander. The method was simple. They packed it with charge and blew it apart. The slab had been standing there for at least 5 centuries. It was roughly 3 meters wide, its surface covered in some 50 lines of densely packed, looping script that no European who had ever looked at it could read. Local tradition wrapped it in legend. A strong man who hurled it into place, a curse, a giant. What is certain is that it carried a long inscription in an unknown hand, and that no one had read it in living memory even before the British arrived. The stone is generally dated to at least the 13th century, and possibly as early as the 10th or 11th. Placing it inside the world of Temasek, the trading settlement that stood where the modern city now stands. The script has never been deciphered. Proposals point toward Old Javanese, toward Sanskrit, toward Tamil, hinting that this corner of the Malay world was tied into the great Hindu-Buddhist maritime states to the south. But proposals are all they are. And here the loss becomes almost unbearable to think about, because most of the evidence no longer exists. After the explosion, an officer named Lieutenant Colonel James Lowe crossed the river and salvaged what fragments he could find with letters still on them. Most were lost. One surviving piece, a single corner of a monument that once held perhaps 50 lines, sits today behind glass in the National Museum of Singapore. The rest was carted off as rubble or sank into the harbor mud. This is the quiet horror that runs under this entire countdown, stated plainly at the start. A civilization left a record. The record survived storms, invasions, and 500 years of monsoon. Then it met an engineer with a schedule and a box of explosives, and it did not survive that. Calling the operation clearing the passageway is technically correct, in the same way that calling a demolition renovation is technically correct. In 2024, a new generation of researchers turned modern imaging on the surviving fragment, trying to recover sign shapes worn smooth by handling and time. The work continues. But no one is pretending we will ever read the lines that were blown into the river. Whatever that monument announced, a king, a victory, a debt, a law, is gone. What remains is a fist-sized stub of stone and the certainty that someone, 800 years ago, considered its message important enough to carve into rock the size of a wall. We have the rock. We do not have the message. And the men who erased it were not conquerors or fanatics. They were just widening a river. But a smashed stone at least reveals what shattered it. The next object on this list was preserved perfectly, fired hard, handled with care for over 3,000 years, and it is no easier to read. Number 9. The Phaistos Disc. It is a disc of fired clay, about 16 centimeters across, roughly the width of a dinner plate, and it is one of the strangest objects ever pulled out of the ground. In July of 1908, the Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier was excavating the Minoan palace of Phaistos in southern Crete when he found it lying in a basement room, almost intact, its surface crowded with pictures arranged in a spiral that winds inward to the center. Both faces are covered. In total, there are 241 sign impressions, drawn from a set of 45 distinct symbols: heads with feathered crowns, walking feet, fish, birds, a flowering branch, a shield. They spiral from the rim toward the middle, divided into groups by small scored lines, like words separated by spaces. For more than a century, no one has agreed on what any of it says. But the script is not even the most unusual thing about the disc. Look closely at the signs, and you realize they were not scratched into the clay by hand. Each one was punched in with a pre-made stamp, a physical seal carved with that symbol, pressed into the soft clay before firing. 45 different stamps, used over and over across both faces. Consider what that means. To make this object, someone first manufactured a complete set of reusable type. One stamp for every sign in the system. That is an enormous investment of effort for a single disc. No one carves a font to print one page. Stamps imply repetition. They imply that whoever made this expected to stamp the same signs again on other surfaces many times over. This is, by a wide margin, the earliest known use of movable type anywhere on Earth, predating the printing press by roughly 3,000 years. And yet the disc is unique, not rare, not one of a small family, unique. Despite a century of digging across Minoan Crete, no second stamped object has ever appeared. No other use of those 45 seals. Nothing. A technology that should leave traces everywhere left exactly one artifact, and then vanished from the record entirely. That uniqueness has a darker edge. It has made some scholars suspect the disc is a modern forgery, a clever fake slipped into the excavation. The objection is reasonable on its face. A one-of-a-kind object with no parallels is exactly what a forger produces. But the mainstream view holds it to be genuine, consistent in clay and style with the Middle Minoan world of around 1700 BC, and the burden of proof sits firmly on the doubters. What remains undisputed is that no one can read it. Every few years, someone announces a decipherment. The disc is a prayer to a Minoan goddess. It is a list of towns. It is a calendar, a contract, a hymn, a board game. None of these readings has ever convinced the wider field, for a brutal structural reason. With only 241 signs on a single object, there is simply not enough text to test any theory against. A code can only be broken if you have enough of it to find patterns. The disc is a sentence the length of a tweet, written in a language spoken by no one, using an alphabet that appears nowhere else. So the Phaistos Disc sits in the museum in Heraklion as a closed door with a doorknob. We know it was meant to be read. We know its maker built specialized tools to produce it. We can see in the careful spiral and the neat divisions the unmistakable shape of language. We just cannot get in. The disc, at least, was the work of a palace civilization we know well from other sources. The next entry takes us back nearly 5,000 years further, to marks that may not be writing at all, scratched into the shells of turtles. Number 8. The Jiahu symbols. Roughly 6,600 years before the Common Era, more than 8,500 years ago, in the floodplain of the Yellow River in Henan Province, central China, a Neolithic community buried its dead with care. They placed grave goods in the pits. Among those goods, in some of the graves, were the shells of turtles, and on a handful of those shells, someone had carved signs. The site is called Jiahu, and it is one of the oldest farming villages ever found in China, a place of rice cultivation, of bone flutes still capable of playing a scale, of organized burial. When archaeologists examined the tortoiseshell plastrons and a few bone and pottery fragments, they isolated a small set of deliberately incised marks. The count is modest. About 11 signs that researchers regard as definitely intentional, 9 of them carved on tortoise shells and 2 on bone. One looks startlingly like a later Chinese character for eye. Another resembles a window or the sun. In 2003, in the journal Antiquity, Garmin Harbottle of Brookhaven National Laboratory, working with archaeologists from the University of Science and Technology of China, presented these marks to the wider world and asked an explosive question in the very title of the paper. Was this the earliest writing? Here is where caution has to do real work, because the honest answer is probably not. And that probably not is more interesting than a yes would be. 11 signs across thousands of years is not a text. They do not form sentences. They show no grammar, no fixed order, no phonetic structure linking them to spoken words. The careful classification is proto-writing, symbols that carry meaning, ownership, ritual, or identity, but do not yet record language the way a sentence does. Most specialists place Jiahu firmly on the near side of that line, but the line itself is the point. The Jiahu marks predate the first true Chinese writing, the oracle bone script of the Shang dynasty, by roughly 5,000 years. 5,000 years. That is the distance between us and the building of the first Egyptian pyramids twice over. And the medium refuses to be a coincidence. The oracle bones of the Shang, the foundation of all Chinese writing, were very often inscribed on exactly this surface, the plastron of a turtle, heated until it cracked, the cracks read as messages from ancestors. So we are left with a thread we cannot quite grasp. People in the Yellow River Valley were carving symbols into tortoise shells and placing them in graves 5 millennia before the same culture in the same region would carve its first readable script into the same kind of shell. Is that continuity, a ritual habit so deep it survived the rise and fall of countless societies? Or is it two unrelated peoples who simply found the same flat bone convenient? The evidence cannot yet decide. What it can do is move the conversation. For a long time, the story of writing had a single capital city, Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians pressed the first cuneiform into clay. Jiahu does not overturn that, but it shows that the impulse to fix meaning into a durable surface, to make a mark that outlives the hand that made it, was alive in China at a date that makes the Sumerian first look like a late chapter rather than the opening page. 11 signs on a turtle's shell, in a grave older than almost anything. Not a sentence, not a language, but not nothing either. And once you accept that the urge to write appeared independently, far from Mesopotamia, the next question is obvious. How many times did it happen? In the river valleys of southeastern Europe, the answer seems to be constantly. Number 7. The Vinca symbols. Across the Balkans, in the river valleys of modern Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and beyond, archaeologists keep pulling the same thing out of the ground. Pottery, figurines, spindle whorls, and loom weights, made by a Neolithic farming culture we call Vinca. And an astonishing number of them are marked with signs. Not decoration, signs. Crosses, chevrons, combs, brackets, swirls, little ladders and forks, repeated across hundreds of sites and thousands of objects over a span of more than 1,000 years. The bulk of these marks date to between roughly 4,500 and 4,000 BC, though some related material reaches back further still. The corpus is large enough that scholars have tried to catalog it. In the early 1980s, the researcher Shan Win assembled the signs into an inventory and counted something on the order of 200 distinct symbols, a number suggestively close to the size of a real sign system. Collectively, the phenomenon goes by several names: the Vinca script, the Old European script, the Danube script, and it predates Sumerian cuneiform by more than 1,000 years. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the single fact that has made the Vinca symbols a battlefield. The oldest writing the textbooks recognize, the Proto-Cuneiform of Uruk in Mesopotamia, appears around 3300 BC. The Vinca marks were already old by then. If they are writing, the map of where literacy began is wrong, and the center of gravity shifts from the Near East to the Danube. That if is enormous, and the field is genuinely split over it. The mainstream interpretation holds that the Vinca symbols are proto-writing, or even simpler, ownership marks, potter's signatures, religious or decorative motifs, meaningful but not encoding spoken language. The reasoning is concrete. The marks tend to appear singly or in tiny clusters, not in long strings. They show no stable word order, no grammar, no sign that they were ever read aloud. A second school, associated with researchers who championed the idea of an old Europe, argued the signs were a true script whose language is simply lost. A minority pushes further, claiming partial readings. Coincidence is possible, but the sheer scale and consistency of the system across 1,000 years demands more than a shrug. There is a telling detail in where the marks were placed. Many of them sit on the bottoms of pots or on the bases of figurines. Surfaces no one would choose for a public message. No one carves an announcement where it cannot be seen. That placement argues quietly against literature and towards something more private, a mark of who owned a thing, or who made it, or which spirit it belonged to. The Vinca people were not writing books on the undersides of their bowls. But even the cautious reading leaves something remarkable standing. Here was a network of farming villages spread across an entire region of Europe that shared a common set of abstract symbols and used them consistently for over a millennium.
Whatever those signs meant, the people who made them agreed on the meaning well enough to keep using them generation after generation across hundreds of kilometers. That is not language, perhaps, but it is the social machinery that language runs on. Shared, durable, agreed-upon meaning, fixed into clay. The Vinca symbols mark the threshold itself, the exact place where the human mind is reaching for writing and has not quite closed its hand. And right at the heart of that culture, in a Romanian pit, 3 small clay tablets were found that pushed the whole argument from interesting to explosive. Number 6. The Tartaria tablets.
In 1961, the Romanian archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa was digging at a site called Tartaria in the Transylvanian hills about 30 kilometers from Alba Iulia, when he uncovered something that would unsettle European prehistory for the next 60 years. In a ritual pit, he found 3 small tablets of clay covered in incised signs of the Vinca type. 2 were rectangular, 1 was round, only about 6 centimeters across. 2 had been pierced with a small hole, as if meant to be worn or hung. They did not come alone. The pit also held the burned, broken bones of a mature woman, somewhere around 55 years old, along with 26 clay figurines, 2 alabaster idols, and a bracelet made from spondylus, a Mediterranean shell traded over great distances. This was no rubbish heap. It was a deliberate deposit, a grave or a votive offering, and the tablets were part of it. Then came the dating, and the dating is where everything fractured.
Other organic material from the Tartaria layers was radiocarbon dated to before 4000 BC, and some researchers argue the tablets themselves belong to a horizon around 5300 BC. If that early date holds, these 3 little tablets are older than the first writing of Mesopotamia by well over 1,000 years. They would be, on that reading, among the oldest inscribed objects on the planet, sitting in a hillside in Romania more than a millennium before anyone in Sumer pressed a reed into clay. The scientific community did not take this calmly, and it should not have. The problems are real, and they are serious. The stratigraphy of the find was never properly documented. Vlasa never fully explained the exact circumstances. Some critics went further and suggested forgery, pointing out that a few of the signs resemble Sumerian symbols that had been reproduced in popular Romanian books available at the time. The accusation is not absurd, and here lies the cruelest twist in the whole affair. After the tablets were excavated, they were baked, heat-treated to harden and preserve them. That act of preservation erased the one thing that could have settled the argument. Firing the clay reset its carbon clock, making it impossible to ever radiocarbon date the tablets directly. So the objects were saved, and the answer was burned out of them in the same gesture. A more perfect way to lock a mystery shut would be hard to design. The forgery charge has not gone unanswered. In the early 2000s, Romanian scholars examined the tablets under the microscope and reported soil traces pressed deep into the incised lines, dirt that had worked its way into the cuts during a long burial, not the clean grooves of a recent fake, and a clay composition matching local Vinca pottery. That does not prove the earliest date, but it argues hard against the idea that someone carved them last century and salted the dig.
So what do we actually have? 3 tablets, undeciphered, covered in signs from a system no one can read, found with the bones of a single woman who was clearly treated as important in a culture that vanished thousands of years before Rome. We cannot read the marks. We cannot securely date the clay. We cannot even fully agree on whether the signs are writing. What we can say is that someone in Neolithic Transylvania thought these symbols mattered enough to bury them with the dead. The Vinca world and its tablets hover forever on the edge of writing, where the evidence runs out. To find a system that is unquestionably true writing, full bureaucratic, sentence-building, civilization-running writing, and still cannot be read, we have to cross into Iran, into a script that ran an entire economy and then died so completely it took its own grammar with it. Number 5. Proto-Elamite. There are more than 1,500 of them.
Clay tablets, palm-sized, packed edge to edge with numbers and signs, dug out of the Great Mound of Susa in southwestern Iran and from a scatter of other sites across the Iranian plateau. They are not decorative. They are not ritual. They are receipts. The paperwork of a working administration that counted grain, livestock, labor, and goods more than 5,000 years ago. And we cannot read most of them. The script is called Proto-Elamite, and it is among the oldest writing systems on Earth, in use from around 3200 to 2900 BC. It emerged at the very dawn of writing, alongside the proto-cuneiform of Mesopotamia next door, and in fact borrowed the idea and some of the number signs from its neighbor before going its own way. This is, by any reasonable definition, real writing. Abstract, systematic, used across a wide territory to run a complex economy. The civilization that produced it kept books. We have the books. We are illiterate before them.
Roughly 80 to 90% of the signs remain undeciphered. We can read the numbers, the accountant's tallies of how much of something there was. We can sometimes tell that a tablet is recording a transaction, but the words, the names, the actual content riding on top of the arithmetic stay dark. It is like holding 1,000 spreadsheets where you can see every total but cannot read a single column heading. In 2012, Jacob Dahl of the University of Oxford led a project to attack the problem with technology, using a specialized imaging rig to capture the worn tablets in extraordinary detail, photographing the surfaces from many angles to drag faint impressions back into visibility. Working with colleagues, his team imaged on the order of 1,100 Proto-Elamite tablets held in the vaults of the Louvre in Paris, and put them online for the world to study. More eyes, sharper images, better tools. And still, the script resists, for a reason Dahl himself has pointed to, a reason that is almost human in its sadness. The Proto-Elamite scribes made mistakes, a lot of them, and, crucially, the system had no mechanism to correct them. Errors were copied forward. There is little sign of the kind of standardized training, the schools and correction and orthodox spelling that let a writing tradition stabilize and survive. Dahl has argued that the script may have been adopted quickly, used hard by a small group of administrators, and never properly taught to a next generation. It did not fail because it was conquered. It failed because nobody learned it well enough to keep it alive. That is the unsettling thing this entry reveals about writing itself. We tend to imagine literacy as a one-way ratchet. Once invented, it spreads and endures. Proto-Elamite is the counterexample.
A society reached the threshold of true writing, used it to run a real economy for 2 or 3 centuries, and then let it slip out of their hands entirely. The script went extinct, and because it was never standardized, never schooled, never corrected, it left no clean key behind. The accountants who could read it died, and the meaning died with them, leaving only the numbers, the one part of any language that is hardest to lie about and easiest to lose the context of. 1,500 tablets, an entire administrative class, an entire economy, fixed in clay and baked hard enough to survive 5,000 years. And we can count their sheep, but not name their gods. A bureaucracy this committed to record-keeping deserved, you would think, at least one reader left behind. It did not get one. Iran gave us a script that ran a state and still went silent. But at least we know where writing came from in the old world, even if we cannot always read it.
The next entry forces a far stranger admission, that writing was invented from nothing in a place the textbooks were not ready for. Number 4. The Cascajal block. In the late 1990s, road builders were quarrying gravel from a mound near the village of Lomas de Tacamichapan in the lowlands of Veracruz, Mexico, the ancient heartland of the Olmec, the oldest complex civilization in the Americas. In the pile of debris, someone noticed a slab of greenish serpentine stone, about the size of a small cutting board, with signs carved into its flat face. It was set aside. It took years before scholars understood what had been pulled out of that gravel. The Cascajal block carries 62 signs, some of them repeated, drawn from an inventory of roughly 28 distinct symbols. They look like objects: an ear of corn, an insect, a fish, a throne, what may be a pineapple.
They are arranged not in vertical columns like later Mesoamerican writing, but in horizontal rows, with signs grouped in clusters and certain sequences recurring. The kind of repetition and patterning that, to specialists, signals language rather than decoration. In 2006, in the journal Science, a team including María del Carmen Rodríguez Martínez, Ponciano Ortiz Ceballos, and the Mesoamerican scholars Stephen Houston, Carl Taub, Michael Coe, and Richard Deal published the block and made the claim plainly. This is the oldest writing in the New World. The associated pottery and figurines from the find place it in the San Lorenzo phase of Olmec culture, ending around 900 BC. That is centuries older than the earliest Zapotec writing, the previous record holder, and it pushes literacy in the Americas back into a period when scholars had assumed there was none. This matters more than a date on a chart because it speaks to one of the deepest questions about our species. Writing, as far as we can tell, was invented independently only a small number of times in all of human history, in Mesopotamia, in China, in Mesoamerica, and possibly Egypt. Each of those is a separate, unrepeatable event, a people inventing from absolutely nothing the idea that speech can be made visible. The Cascajal block is physical evidence of the American invention, the moment in the Olmec world that an idea became a sign on stone. But here is where the discovery becomes genuinely frustrating and where honesty has to override excitement. The block is an orphan. It was not found in a controlled excavation, in a sealed layer with its context intact. It was found in a gravel pile, already dug out of the ground by a bulldozer, its original setting obliterated. The dating rests on the material found around it, not on the block itself in place.
And it is, like the Phaistos Disc, alone, a single object with no second example of its sign system anywhere. 62 signs is not enough to decipher, and there is nothing else to compare it against. So the Cascajal block sits in a peculiar position. It is, almost certainly, the founding document of writing in the Western Hemisphere, and it is mute. We cannot read a word of it. We cannot even be fully sure of where it lay before the diggers found it. What we can see, in the careful rows and the repeating clusters, is the unmistakable signature of a mind organizing language into symbols, 3,000 years ago, on a continent that had no contact whatsoever with the literate worlds of Asia or the Mediterranean. It is proof that the human capacity for writing is not a fluke of one place. Given a complex enough society, the idea seems to surface on its own, again and again, across oceans, with no one teaching anyone.
And if writing can be invented from nothing in isolation, it can also be invented in the most isolated place on the entire planet. A speck of land in the Pacific where, against every expectation, people may have done exactly that. Number 3, Rongo Rongo. By the time anyone with a notebook sat down and asked the people of Easter Island what their writing meant, the answer had already died with them. That is the heart of this story, and it is one of the most quietly devastating losses in the history of human knowledge. The script is called Rongo Rongo, and it is the only writing system ever developed in all of Oceania, the vast scatter of Pacific islands settled by some of the greatest seafarers our species has produced. It survives on fewer than 30 wooden objects, tablets, a chief's staff, a couple of figures, a piece of carved wood that may once have been a ship's railing. 25 inscriptions in total, scattered now through museums across the world. The glyphs are tiny, crisp, beautiful. Birds, fish, plants, human figures with raised arms, abstract shapes, packed in dense rows. And they are carved in one of the most disorienting layouts ever devised. The lines run in reverse boustrophedon. You read one line left to right, then you must physically turn the entire tablet upside down to read the next, then turn it back for the line after that. The text flips on itself row by row, like a furrow plowed first one way and then the other. To read it, the reader's whole body had to participate. The first outsider to describe the tablets was a French lay missionary, Eugène Ayrault, who arrived on the island in 1864 and noted wooden boards covered in signs in nearly every house. He did not think much of them. By 1868, when the Bishop of Tahiti, Florentin Etienne Jussin, received a tablet wrapped in a cord of human hair and grasped its importance, the catastrophe was already underway.
In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raids and the epidemics that followed had swallowed much of the island's population, and with them, almost everyone who held the knowledge of how to read. The ariki, the priests and trained men who could recite the boards, were gone within a few terrible years. What happened next is the part that should make anyone who values knowledge wince. Yausen found a man named Mitoro who claimed he could read the tablets and recorded his chanting. For decades, scholars treated those chants as a key. Then, in the 20th century, the German ethnologist Thomas Bartel identified a passage on the tablet known as Mamati as a lunar calendar, one of the only stretches of Rongo Rongo anyone has plausibly understood. And when researchers checked Mitoro's reading of that very passage against it, the truth came out. Mitoro had read the calendar backwards. He had failed to recognize an obvious pictogram of the full moon sitting in the middle of it.
He could not actually read the tablets at all. The last apparent reader was already guessing. The chain of knowledge had snapped, and it snapped fast, within a single generation. That is the terror specific to this entry. The other scripts on this list died slowly, over centuries, their readers fading out one by one. Rongo Rongo died in a decade, while Europeans were standing right there, holding the tablets, taking notes, and not understanding that the living library in front of them was burning down in real time. There is a final twist that keeps the mystery wide open. In February of 2024, Silvia Ferrara and colleagues at the University of Bologna published radiocarbon dates for 4 tablets held in Rome in the journal Scientific Reports. 3 dated, as expected, to the 19th century. But the wood of one, the tablet known as Échancré, yielded a calibrated date of somewhere between 1493 and 1509.
The caution is important. That date is for the wood, not necessarily for the carving, and old wood can be reused. But if the script was being cut into timber that old, it raises the possibility that Rongo Rongo was invented on Rapa Nui before any European ever set foot there, an independent birth of writing on the loneliest inhabited island on Earth. We may never know, because the people who could have told us were taken, and the one who claimed he could read held the calendar upside down. But if a script can be lost in a single generation on a remote island, what happens when the entire language behind a script disappears? When you can sound out every sign and still understand nothing? Number 2. Linear A. Here is the cruelest variant of this entire problem. With Linear A, we can read it. We can stand over a 3,500-year-old clay tablet from Minoan Crete and pronounce, sign by sign, the sounds it records. We can say the words aloud.
And we do not understand a single one of them. To see how that is even possible, look at its twin. Sir Arthur Evans, excavating the Palace of Knossos from 1900 onward, found 2 related scripts in the Cretan clay and named them simply Linear A and Linear B. For half a century, both were unreadable. Then, in 1952, a young English architect named Michael Ventris cracked Linear B and revealed, to general astonishment, that it recorded an early form of Greek. The Mycenaeans who took over Crete had borrowed the Minoan signs to write their own language. Linear B opened. Its accounts, its inventories, its lists of offerings could suddenly be read. And because Linear A and Linear B share a great many of the same signs, Ventris's breakthrough handed us a strange, partial gift. We can take the sound values proved for Linear B and apply them to the older Linear A signs. We can transliterate the Minoan tablets. The sounds come out.
But the language those sounds spell is not Greek, and it is not any other language we know. It is the lost tongue of the Minoans themselves, a people who built Europe's first advanced civilization, with palaces and plumbing and fleets, and whose speech vanished without a single surviving relative we can identify. The corpus is not tiny. There are something like 1,400 Linear A inscriptions, the great majority of them administrative, clay tablets, sealings, and tags from across Crete, with the richest archive at the site of Hagia Triada, which alone produced over 100 tablets. These are the records of a working economy: receipts, lists, totals. We even think we recognize a few words by their position and repetition. The sign group read as kuro appears where a sum belongs, at the bottom of columns of figures, and is generally taken to mean total. Think about what that means.
We can pick up a Minoan ledger from 1700 BC, read down a column of commodities and numbers, reach the bottom, and say the word for total out loud in a dead language, and still have no idea what was being counted, or for whom, or why. We are like a person who has memorized the sounds of a foreign poem perfectly and grasps nothing of its meaning. The voice works. The mind is locked out. This is the precise inversion of most of the scripts on this list. With the Indus seals, or Rongo Rongo, or the Phaistos Disc, we are stopped at the signs themselves. We cannot even reliably assign sounds. With linear A, we sailed past that wall and ran straight into a higher one. The problem is not the script. The script, in a sense, is solved. The problem is that the people who spoke Minoan are gone, and they left no bilingual text, no Rosetta Stone pairing their words with a language we know. Without that bridge, the sounds are just sounds. Decades of effort have produced proposed links to early Greek, to a Semitic language, to Anatolian tongues, to Luwian. None has won the field. The honest position remains that the language of linear A is unclassified. We hear it, and we do not know what family it belongs to. A whole civilization is speaking to us, clearly, in a steady voice, in words we can repeat and cannot comprehend. And if the Minoans, with their 1,400 tablets and their deciphered cousin script, can defeat us this completely, then the largest puzzle of all becomes almost unbearable. A civilization bigger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined that left thousands of inscriptions, and not one of them long enough or paired with anything to let us in. Number 1. The Indus script. Picture yourself walking through a city 4,500 years ago. The streets run in a grid laid out to the points of the compass. Brick houses rise on either side, built from bricks made to a standard ratio, the same ratio used in cities hundreds of kilometers away. Beneath the street runs a covered drainage system that would not be matched in much of the world for another 4,000 years. There are public baths, granaries, wells, workshops. There are weights, small, polished, cut to a precise binary standard, identical from one city to the next. This is a civilization of careful planning, of standardization, of order on a scale nothing else in its age could match. And it is silent. This is the Indus Valley, or Harappan civilization, which flourished from roughly 2600 to 1900 BC across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia put together. Its great cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, may have held tens of thousands of people each, parts of a network supporting well over 1 million souls. They traded with Mesopotamia. Harappan seals turn up in the ruins of Sumerian cities. By every measure of complexity, urban planning, craft, trade, standardization, this was one of the supreme achievements of the ancient world, and we cannot read a word they wrote. They did write, or at least they made marks. More than 4,000 inscribed objects survive, most of them small steatite seals carved with an animal and a short line of signs above it. A unicorn-like beast, a bull, an elephant, a seated horned figure, and over them, the script. Scholars have cataloged something on the order of 400 distinct signs, which is a number that tells its own story. Too many to be an alphabet, where a few dozen letters suffice. About right for a logosyllabic system, where signs stand for words and syllables, like Sumerian or Mayan. The script appears across the entire Harappan world, stable and consistent for the better part of 1,000 years. But here the standard story of decipherment hits a wall built from the evidence itself, and the wall has 3 courses of brick. There is no bilingual text, no Rosetta Stone pairing Indus signs with a language we can read. The underlying language is unknown and fiercely disputed. The leading candidate, argued for decades by Asko Parpala at the University of Helsinki, is some early form of Dravidian, but it cannot be proven. And the inscriptions are catastrophically short.
The average Indus text is around 4 or 5 signs long. The longest single-surface inscription known runs to just 17 signs. There are no archives, no tablets of running prose, no chronicles. The entire surviving output of a literate metropolis fits, sign for sign, on objects you could hold in one hand. That brevity has driven the most provocative argument of all. In 2004, the scholars Steve Farmer, Richard Sproat, and Michael Witzel published a paper contending that the Indus script is not writing at all, that the signs are too short, too few, too riddled with one-off symbols to encode language, and are instead a system of non-linguistic emblems, marks of clan, of office, of religion, of trade. The reaction was volcanic. In India, the claim was received as an insult to national heritage. The authors faced fury and reportedly worse. The scholarly counterattack came in 2009, when a team led by Rajesh Rao published a statistical analysis in Science, arguing that the patterning of Indus signs, the way they follow one another, matches the mathematical signature of real languages and not that of decorative symbol sets. The debate has not been settled. We are not merely unable to read the Indus script. We cannot fully agree on whether it is a script. Sit with the full weight of that.
This is not a single smashed stone, or one strange disc, or a dozen wooden boards. This is the writing of the largest and most sophisticated civilization of its entire era. A society that engineered cities and standardized its bricks and weights across 500,000 square kilometers. And it has left us a record so terse, so utterly without a key, that after a century and a half of brilliant minds attacking it, we have no agreed reading of even one sign, and a serious faction that doubts there is anything to read. You can walk through Mohenjo-Daro today, stand in a street they paved, look down a drain they engineered, hold a weight they cut to a standard so exact it still measures true. Every physical thing here speaks of planners, organizers, people of relentless order. And the one thing they made to speak across time, the marks they pressed into stone and carried in their hands, says nothing we can hear. Not a name, not a god, not a king. Not a single sentence we can be sure is a sentence. The Indus script is the hardest evidence we have of a simple, humbling fact. A civilization can be complex beyond doubt and still be sealed against us forever. Greatness does not guarantee a voice across time. It guarantees only ruins and the possibility, never the certainty, that someone, someday, finds the key. We built the assumption that writing began in one place, spread outward, and improved in a tidy line. These cities and the silent seals in their dust were laid out in defiance of that story long before we invented it. Across all 10 of these scripts, the same pattern keeps surfacing, and it has nothing to do with how advanced a people were. The Singapore stone carvers, the Minoan accountants, the Olmec, the Harappans, the readers of Easter Island, every one of them was organized enough, settled enough, ambitious enough to fix meaning into a durable surface and trust it to outlast them. The trust was misplaced.
A script does not survive on its own. It survives only as long as a living chain of people can read it, or as long as it leaves behind a bilingual bridge to a language that endures. Break the chain and burn the bridge, and even true writing becomes what these 10 have become. Beautiful, deliberate, undeniably meaningful marks that say nothing to anyone alive. We like to imagine literacy as humanity's great victory over forgetting. These scripts are the fine print. Writing was invented independently in Mesopotamia, in China, in Mesoamerica, on a Pacific island, and possibly along the Danube and the Indus. Far more often and far earlier, and in far more places than the single origin story allows. And just as often, it died. Starved of readers, smashed by an engineer, baked beyond dating, drowned in a harbor, carried off by slavers, copied with errors by scribes no one ever corrected. The marks outlasted the people. The meaning did not.
Somewhere under the soil of 4 continents lie the records of societies that thought they had made themselves permanent, written in hands no living person can read. And the only honest thing we can say about most of them is that they were here, They were organized, and they had something to say. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.